Laconia, New Hampshire, October 14th, 2003. At 7:18 a.m., unmarked sedans and two black and white cruisers rolled onto a short residential spur off a secondary road that feeds toward the north end of Lake Opechee. Patrol units from Laconia Police Department established a simple perimeter. One car angled across the mouth of the street, another idling near a fire hydrant, lights steady, but sirens silent. A third vehicle, a state police sedan, parked nose-to-tail behind a green pickup in the driveway of a 1.5-story cape with vinyl siding and a small front porch. The porch light was still on. Frost glazed the top rail. The team executed a knock and announce consistent with a sealed arrest warrant obtained the previous evening through Belknap County Superior Court. The home's blinds twitched. A figure appeared briefly in the front window, then moved out of view. Within seconds, the front door opened. A man stepped onto the threshold, empty hands visible, shoulders squared. He wore a gray sweatshirt, work pants, and wire-rim glasses. His hair was clipped short. He looked older than his driver's license implied. Commands were issued in a normal tone. He complied at once. An officer guided him down the 2 steps, turned him toward the yard, and applied hinged cuffs with the double lock engaged. The man did not speak. He did not resist. He kept his eyes on the frost-rimed lawn. A second officer checked the waistband and ankles. A third secured the door and called in the time. The arrest was routine by procedure, unusual by context. Neighbors came to their windows. One man in a bathrobe stood with a newspaper in his hand and did not raise it to read. Another resident stepped out onto a porch a few houses down and hesitated, then retreated indoors. No one approached the perimeter. The street remained quiet other than the idle of the cruisers and the sound of boots on wood. An investigator from the New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit carried a hard-sided case to the porch and passed it to a detective wearing nitrile gloves. 2 technicians from the evidence unit followed with paper evidence bags, pre-printed seals, and a clipboard. They moved with practiced economy. The scene was not a crime scene. It was a residence associated by affidavit with a cold case review. Still, every contact was minimized and documented. The entry team affixed a strip camera log to the interior doorframe and photographed the latch plate and deadbolt position. A uniformed officer recorded serial numbers from items in plain view, then turned them face down and left them in place until a separate search warrant could be presented. The line between arrest and search was kept deliberate. A supervisor from Laconia PD stood at the driveway's edge, radio angled against his shoulder, watching the transport unit back in. The unmarked car was a late-model sedan with a vinyl rear seat and no inner handles. The rear passenger side door opened. The man in cuffs stepped forward, bent at the waist, and sat without prompting. An officer fastened the seatbelt. The door closed. The supervisor logged the time again. By 7:31 a.m., the transport departed for the Belknap County facility. The route was not long. The cruiser at the end of the spur reversed out and reopened the road. Traffic, sparse at this hour on a weekday, resumed. A white panel van with state plates eased into the driveway to deliver a rolling case and a collapsible cart. The technicians returned to the porch and documented the threshold once more. They waited in the cold until the separate search warrant arrived. The case had not been sudden. It had not been impulsive. It had moved in a series of small, exact steps. The sealed affidavit cited a reevaluation of retained materials, a re-review of photographs, and a lab report that arrived late the previous week. The content remained sealed, but the timing was clear. A 4-year interval had just narrowed to a door, a porch, and a pair of handcuffs that clicked twice and did not loosen. Outside, the lawn showed signs of regular care. A red canoe lay inverted against the fence line with a nylon strap looped through its handles. The mailbox bore adhesive numbers that matched the address on the warrant. On the porch, a boot scraper held traces of sand. A metal thermos stood just inside the threshold where it had been set down. The house did not look abandoned or disordered. It looked like a place where a morning had been interrupted mid-motion. Inside, the first wave of photographs documented the front room. A small television on a stand, a calendar pinned to a corkboard, a key hook with 2 keys and a whistling key ring. On the kitchen counter, a notepad lay open to a grocery list. Next to it, a book of stamps. A detective passed the camera to a technician and stepped back out to the porch to avoid unnecessary overlap. The team leader checked off each action on the operations sheet. A second detective placed a call to the county attorney to confirm that the search warrant was en route with a courier. No press had been notified in advance. Within an hour, word would pass from window to window and across the parking lot of a nearby hardware store. The presence of a state van in a quiet neighborhood was enough to start a chain, but at the time of the arrest, there were only the necessary personnel, the suspect, and the street. At the county facility, intake proceeded by the book. The man was identified, photographed, and fingerprinted. Personal property was inventoried. 1 wallet, 1 watch, 1 small ring of keys, 1 folded receipt, 1 $10 bill, and 2 singles. He requested a jacket. A deputy logged the request and secured a standard-issue garment until his personal clothing was cleared. He was placed in a holding area away from common intake, as is typical with cases flagged for investigative hold. A detective read the formal charges and the advisements. The man nodded once. He looked at the floor. Silence filled the space between actions. Back at the residence, a delivery truck slowed, then continued. A leaf blower started on the next street over and ran for a minute, then stopped. The technicians worked without comment. Photographs were bracketed and redundant. Notes were legible and complete. The house's electrical panel was photographed with the cover closed and then open. The attic access was photographed and left undisturbed pending structural clearance. Every room was documented, starting with the entry, moving clockwise, and returning to the kitchen. Each drawer was left closed and numbered. Nothing was removed until the judge's signature arrived. The affidavit had a history. 4 years earlier, a woman who worked an evening shift had not come home. A vehicle had been found near an industrial area along the water. The town had arranged search lines. Volunteers had stepped into the brush and along the shoreline. The first days were immediate and coordinated. The following weeks were exhausted. After that, the case moved into a file room, then into a smaller room where the folders that do not yield quickly go. From time to time, a detective pulled it out, wrote another memo, requested another look. It stayed active by inches rather than miles. Those inches added up. And now there was a morning like this. An officer placed temporary scene tape from the porch rail to the mailbox post. It marked a boundary more than it secured it. The tape fluttered once and settled. The street's cold air held the sound of a dog collar from a neighboring yard. A screen door closed 2 houses down. The van's rear doors remained open, the cart positioned, cases arranged in the order they would be used. At 9:06 a.m., the courier arrived with the signed search warrant and a stamped return. The team leader read it once through, then again. The authority now extended beyond the person to the premises and to specific items set forth in the warrant's language. The parameters were narrow and detailed. The team would not exceed them. A fresh set of gloves replaced those used for the initial documentation. The first items processed were those least likely to degrade and easiest to inventory. The witness to the search stood with a clipboard and wrote in careful block letters. Bag numbers matched log numbers. Seals were pressed twice at the corners and signed across the tape. By midday, the house's rhythms were mapped and recorded. In a bedroom, a small plastic storage bin contained outdoor gear labeled with handwritten tags. In a utility area, a coil of nylon rope lay on a shelf beside a tool kit. In a closet, a jacket hung next to a rain shell. Each item that met the warrant's criteria was photographed in place, photographed again with an evidence marker, and then placed in a paper bag. The paper breathed. Plastic did not. The technicians defaulted to paper unless moisture required otherwise. It did not. The chain of custody began at the moment of collection and would not break. The log included date, time, collector, location within the residence, description, packaging, and transfer. By late afternoon, the first box left the scene bound for the state laboratory in Concord. The second box followed. The van's doors closed without slamming. At the county facility, the man sat alone. A deputy checked on him at regular intervals and recorded each welfare check in a small notebook with the time down to the minute. The man did not request water. He did not ask for a phone call until after lunch. When he did, the call was facilitated in view of a deputy. It was brief. He hung up and returned to the bench and rested his hands palm down on his knees. The cuffs had been removed at intake. The marks on his wrists were faint dentations in the skin that would fade. By 3:10 p.m., the county attorney's office prepared a press statement that contained only what could be made public: the arrest, the charge, the date of the scheduled arraignment, and a reminder that the affidavit was sealed pending further action. The statement did not include a narrative. It did not identify items removed from the residence. It did not refer to any laboratory process. It did not identify the victim by full name, though nearly everyone in town knew it anyway. The statement carried no adjectives. It carried only the necessary facts. Outside, the October light faded early. The porch light at the residence remained on, though no one would return there that evening. The house was sealed. The tape remained across the door. A uniformed officer had been assigned to scene watch until the morning. He sat in a cruiser with the engine off to avoid drawing attention, hat tipped forward just enough to keep the light out of his eyes, radio volume low. He wrote in his log, then paused, then wrote again. The street remained as it had been at 7:18 a.m., quiet, direct, and unadorned. In a file room across town, a detective lifted a box from a shelf and set it on a metal table. The label on the spine read with a date, a location, a brief description, and a case number that had followed the department for 4 years. He unlatched the lid and checked the contents against the inventory list. The list matched. Everything that should have been there was there. Everything collected that day would be added to a new sheet with new numbers and the same care. The detective placed the lid back on the box and returned it to the shelf. He turned off the light and closed the door. The man in custody was moved to a standard cell for the night. He lay down on a fixed steel bunk and faced the wall. The facility quieted, as it did every evening. Patrol shifts rotated. The state lab prepared to receive the boxes collected during the day. Intake would be logged after hours as necessary. The case had been slow until it had not been. The arrest did not answer questions. It did not announce a conclusion. It marked a point in a measured sequence: affidavit, warrant, arrest, search, custody, and the next steps tracked by dates and signatures rather than speculation. 4 Octobers had passed between the first call and this morning. The interval ended on a porch with frost on the rail and a man who did not look up as the cuffs closed. Tomorrow would bring arraignment. The day after would bring motions. The week would bring disclosures, some sealed, some redacted, all filed. The reasons for this morning would remain inside envelopes for now. The community would add details of its own, some accurate, some not. But the timeline was fixed. The arrest occurred at 7:18 a.m. The transport departed at 7:31. The first box left the residence at 12:42 p.m., the second at 1:05 p.m. The man remained in custody. The house remained sealed. The lab remained open. 4 years is not a long time in a file room. It is long in a town where the same people shop at the same stores and drive the same streets every week. The morning's quiet did not erase that interval. It acknowledged it. The porch light burned against the dusk. The tape held across the door. The case moved forward one controlled step at a time. Laconia, New Hampshire, October 9th, 1999. The town's Saturday shifted between foliage traffic and the steady routines of the off-season. At the Laconia Library's main floor, the evening desk ran light. A 28-year-old library assistant closed out her shift, balanced the cash box for fines, and initialed the circulation log. The last item stamped out under her initials cleared at 8:42 p.m. A co-worker, shelving in biographies, watched her lock the side door at 8:49 and walk toward a compact sedan parked 3 spaces from the alley. She carried a canvas tote with a hardcover inside and a plastic container with a leftover sandwich. She did not own a mobile phone. Her apartment was a short drive south along Union Avenue. At 9:31 p.m., a cruiser rolled past a row of darkened mill buildings along the Winnipesaukee River and continued on. The officer wrote later that nothing appeared unusual. At 7:12 a.m. the next morning, a city parks worker reported an unattended car on a gravel turnout off a service road behind a warehouse near Opechee Bay. The car's registration matched the library assistant. The driver's door was closed, the windows were up, the vehicle was locked. A tote bag was not inside. Laconia PD responded. The first officer on scene ran the plates, looked in through the glass, and called for a supervisor. The location was a wedge of light industry between water and road, chain-link fencing, pallets stacked under plastic, a cabled gate, puddles from overnight mist. A candy wrapper lay near the front bumper, damp and stuck to the gravel. The officer set a perimeter using patrol cars and contacted the on-call detective. By 8:06 a.m., detectives had marked the car and the turnout with evidence placards, photographed the vehicle from all sides, and attempted to locate the owner at her apartment. She did not answer. A relative, called through dispatch, said she had not come home. The vehicle was processed in place. The handles showed smudging consistent with ordinary use. There was no sign of forced entry. The trunk lid had light scuffing. A fine line of recovered dust on the rear quarter suggested contact with a soft object, fabric or tape, drawn across the paint. On the gravel within 6 feet of the driver's side, a detective observed 3 short pieces of gray pressure-sensitive tape, each less than 2 inches long, curled lengthwise with grit adhering to the adhesive. He used clean forceps to place each piece into separate paper evidence folds and then into envelopes. 30 feet away near a fence post, searchers located a canvas tote turned on its side. Inside were a library hardcover, a plastic container, and her keyring without a vehicle key. The ID card from her wallet rested on the bottom of the bag. The wallet itself was absent. By 10:15 a.m., the department entered her as a missing person with elevated risk, based on the unattended vehicle, the bag, and the absence of contact with family. New Hampshire State Police were notified. Fish and game officers were requested for shoreline search. The turnout was roped with scene tape, and the vehicle was towed undercover to the department garage for controlled processing. A tow operator signed the chain of custody log. Photographs were taken of the tow hook points, the tire positions in relation to the gravel, and the contact points at the bumper to confirm no additional marks were made by removal. The first K9 track started from the driver's door at 11:22 a.m. The dog pulled along a short arc toward the fence and down a footpath to the water's edge. The scent weakened on riprap. A second track from the tote produced a similar route to the same point. The dog then circled. The handler logged a loss of trail at the shoreline. Fish and Game deployed a small John boat with 2 personnel to check a narrow stretch along the bank. No personal effects were found in the water within the initial sweep. The river moved slow at this angle. Beyond the turnout, Opechee Bay opened flat and cold. Detectives canvassed. A security guard on the night shift at a warehouse adjacent to the turnout reported seeing a car enter sometime after 9 p.m. and leave a few minutes later. He could not confirm color or plate. A resident on a parallel street told officers he heard a short horn chirp and a car door closing around 9:20. 2 employees who used the service road before dawn said the turnout was empty at 5:30 a.m. The parks worker said it was there at 7:12. The resulting window narrowed the placement of the vehicle to a period between night and early morning. The apartment was entered with consent from her sister, who had a spare key. The living room showed no disorder. A work schedule posted on the refrigerator listed the Saturday closing shift and a Sunday morning off. On the kitchen counter, a note written in her hand the previous morning referenced returning a book and buying stamps. There was no packed bag, no mail indicating an impending departure, no evidence of a struggle inside. The bed was made. A pair of black flats absent from the closet matched those she had worn at the library. Flyers were printed by late afternoon with her photograph and a description. Volunteers gathered first at the library, then at the high school parking lot. A staging board was set up. Assignments were made to comb the riverwalk, the lots behind the old mill buildings, the brush along the fence line, and the shoulders of Union Avenue. Laconia PD established a tip line. Officers briefed volunteers on not touching found items and on flagging any evidence for a sworn officer. The searchers moved in lines, spaced at arm's length, eyes down. The air was damp and carried the smell of wet leaves. The lines broke and reformed across gullies and culverts. Nothing of evidentiary value was recovered beyond the tote and the 3 small pieces of tape already logged. Investigative focus narrowed by standard considerations. Detectives spoke to a recent boyfriend and to co-workers. Time-stamped circulation logs verified her presence at the library through closing. Vendors near the library reported no unusual activity. The corner store clerk did not recognize her photograph from that evening. There were no active restraining orders. No financial anomalies appeared in her accounts. Her paycheck deposit from the city cleared 2 days prior. No withdrawals occurred thereafter. Phone records for her landline showed no calls after 6:03 p.m. Saturday. Without a cell phone and with limited public surveillance in 1999, the route between the library and the turnout had few tracked points. The car was processed methodically under clean conditions. The door handles were swabbed for touch DNA. The interior was vacuumed over filter paper to capture trace fibers. Latent print powder and tape lifts were attempted on the steering wheel and dashboard. A swab was taken of a faint stain on the edge of the rear seat. A presumptive test was negative for blood. The trunk liner showed a fresh abrasion. The lab photographed the pattern but could not conclusively interpret it. From the exterior paint, a technician lifted a fine smear that suggested a polymer contact event, consistent with tape being handled against the surface. No high-quality latent prints were developed from the interior surfaces using conventional powder. The 3 fragments of gray tape were stored separately with backing paper applied to preserve the adhesive faces. A hair embedded in one fragment was observed with the naked eye. Under low magnification, the hair lacked a root. It was preserved intact and not cut. The envelopes containing the tape were sealed, labeled with date, time, collector, and case number, and placed in a climate-controlled evidence locker. Mistakes and limitations appeared as they do early in cases with incomplete information. Initial patrol notes described the car as secure, no obvious tampering, and one officer touched the driver's door glass to look inside before the tape perimeter was extended. That contact was logged, and the glove used was bagged and labeled, but it added a layer that later processing had to account for. The first 24 hours saw a disproportionate allocation of time to the riverbank based on canine loss of trail near water. Later mapping suggested the trail terminated not at the water's edge itself, but along a line where wind had moved across a break in the fence. The distinction mattered for scent, but was not recognized immediately. The warehouse guard's vague report of a car coming and going led to a nighttime patrol saturation that produced no leads and drained hours that could have gone to structured interviews. None of these were fatal errors. They reflected the constraints of a small department and the absence of a single clear vector. By Monday, October 11th, the case had a number and a box. The box held the first-day items: photographs, chain of custody forms, field notes, tape fragments in envelopes, the hair under a protective mount, and the canvas tote. A detective added a map annotated with X's and arrows, indicating search areas, sightings, and the location of the car. The unit requested lab priority through the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory. The request emphasized the adhesive tape fragments and the embedded hair. It acknowledged that the hair's lack of root likely precluded nuclear STR profiling under then-current protocols. It asked for mitochondrial DNA evaluation if feasible and for any latent processing methods appropriate to tape adhesives. The lab logged receipt and placed the items into the queue. Community response continued. A church near the library organized a meal train for the family. A local printer donated banner space on the baseball field fence with a tip line number. A hardware store put a flyer at each register. Volunteers returned for second and third sweeps of the same terrain. A retired school custodian brought coffee and assigned clipboards. People who did not search came to stand in the lot and wait for assignments that had already been filled. When that happens, the presence itself becomes a kind of assignment. The coordinators acknowledged people by name, thanked them, and entered them into a contact list in case a new sector opened. The tips line recorded calls of varying weight. 3 callers reported seeing a woman matching her description at a gas station near Weirs Boulevard just after 9 p.m. All 3 placed the car incorrectly. One caller said a man in a dark jacket had been near the service road the previous week. No date or time. Another caller insisted the vehicle had not been there at 6 a.m. on Sunday, and then called back to say he had been mistaken about the day. The detectors cleared each call with patience and a form letter response where appropriate. A few calls from outside the county suggested she had left on her own. Those were checked against financials and communications and set aside. As the first week closed, a narrow stack of documents built the public narrative. A missing person, an unattended car near the water, a tote with personal items, an ongoing search. The private narrative contained more detail. The the placement of tape fragments in a pattern consistent with cutting small pieces from a larger strip, the embedded hair without root, the scuff on the trunk lid. None of it constituted proof. All of it constituted a path to proof if and when technology or information improved. Late in October, a body of water search expanded. Fish and Game and a regional dive team conducted a grid in sections of Opechee Bay reachable from the turnout. Visibility was low, water cold, bottom silt soft. The divers found tires, a rusted signpost, and a length of chain. Nothing linked to the missing woman. A side-scan sonar image was considered but not acquired. The equipment was not readily available to the agencies involved in 1999. The decision was documented with cost and availability noted in the margin. Inside the department, case meetings shifted from daily to every other day. Detectives kept the file open and active. The car was released to the family after processing and, with consent, was stored under cover in a relative's garage. The tote remained in evidence. The tape fragments remained sealed. The hair remained untouched after initial observation, pending a lab decision on mitochondrial analysis. In 1999, mtDNA testing was not routine at the state level. It required either a state contract with a federal facility or an external vendor lab, with lead times measured in months. The evidence custodian at Laconia PD documented refrigeration settings for the box that contained the tape and hair envelopes. Though not strictly necessary for these items, the choice favored preservation over risk. Winter passed. Flyers came down and were replaced by a smaller poster at the library desk. A family member called the detective monthly and was answered with the same description of steps taken and steps possible. In March 2000, a call reported a purse by a culvert 2 miles away. It belonged to someone else. In May, a fisherman turned in a ring found in shallow water. It was costume jewelry unrelated to the case. Each item generated paperwork that entered the box and took its place in order. The case did not leave the town's memory. Without overt markers, it persisted in quiet ways, people hesitating when they parked near the turnout, choosing a different route after dusk, keeping an eye on the river path. It persisted in administrative ways, annual budget lines for overtime attached to open investigations, training slots for evidence handling, and a sticky note on a detective's monitor with the case number written in black marker. In the summer of 2001, the state lab returned a report on the first round of testing. Conventional latent development on the non-adhesive sides of the tape fragments yielded no usable ridge detail. Adhesive side processing was deferred due to the risk of compromising any future attempt with higher sensitivity methods. The hair from the adhesive was measured, photographed, and preserved. Microscopic comparisons suggested it was consistent with a male donor of indeterminate age and lacked a root sheath. The lab recommended mtDNA testing if authorized and funded. The report also noted that the tape's substrate and adhesive were consistent with commonly sold gray duct tape. Trace elements were nonspecific. The absence of fingerprints and the presence of a hair that could not be profiled with nuclear DNA were not failures. They were conditions set by time and method. In late 2001 and through 2002, the department cycled personnel. A detective sergeant who had been on the initial scene retired. A younger detective took over the cold case review list as part of his workload. He reread the file. He noted the tape and the hair and the scuff on the trunk and wrote a memo requesting a consult with the state lab on any new adhesive processing. The lab replied that it was exploring access to vacuum metal deposition, VMD, through a regional partnership. The equipment was not a standard fixture statewide. The lab would notify agencies if and when a run became available. Meanwhile, the community maintained events that reflected continuity rather than closure. A book donation at the library in her name, a scholarship fund in a small amount for a student pursuing library science or education. The practical effect on the case was limited. The effect on the file was formal, added pages, added context, added a notation that the case remained assigned. The family provided a DNA reference sample from the victim's mother, a standard step for unidentified remains comparison. The profile entered the appropriate databases. No matches were returned. The final months of 2002 and the start of 2003 brought incremental movement. A call came from the state lab to Laconia PD. Adhesive processing through VMD would be available on a limited basis for selected cases with preserved tape and no previous destructive treatment. The Laconia file qualified. The lab scheduled the tape fragments for the next cycle. The detective documented the chain of custody transfer and hand-carried the envelopes to ensure minimal handling. At the same time, the department authorized mtDNA testing for the hair through an approved laboratory that could sequence the hypervariable regions from rootless shafts. Funding came in part from a state grant designed to reduce backlogs. Those steps were not dramatic to the town. They were not public. They sat on a calendar in the lab, one on a bench schedule, the other in a shipping manifest. But they marked the first time that items collected behind a warehouse near Opechee Bay in 1999 would be subjected to methods that had not been available locally when the case began. They also narrowed the number of viable suspects from the universe of possibility to the smaller universe of people whose Palm Ridge flow would match what adhesive could hold and whose maternal lineage would map against a specific sequence when compared to a reference. The distinction between a general search and a focused one is not visible from the sidewalk. It is visible on a lab report and an affidavit. The turnout off the service road did not change. The chain-link fence rusted a little more at the base. The cabled gate sagged another inch. Trucks still backed in during the week. On weekends, recreational traffic passed within earshot without turning in. The spot did not adopt a reputation. It held a memory. The file held the rest: a car, a tote, 3 small pieces of tape, a hair without a root, and a set of signatures that preserved them. By mid-2003, the file was no longer only a record of what had been done. It was a staging area for what would be done next. The detective met with the county attorney to outline possible paths depending on the lab results. The attorney noted the difference between likelihood and proof and wrote a checklist: latent ridge detail on adhesive, if any, mtDNA sequence and interpretation, comparison populations, identification of persons with regular access to the turnout, collection of known exemplars by consent or warrant, and all necessary documentation for a sealed affidavit if probable cause crystallized. The list did not include guesswork. It included work. The year of the crime had come and gone, and then another and another. The missing person remained missing. The scene remained a turnout behind a warehouse near water. The items collected remained inside envelopes in a series of boxes. In the absence of closure, the town's routines advanced, and the case held its place among the open files. It would not vacate that place without a technical intervention that could convert what had been observed in 1999 into something admissible and specific. That intervention was scheduled, logged, and approaching. The man later arrested in October 2003 had been visible in town throughout the 4-year interval. He worked as an emergency medical technician and taught basic first aid and CPR as an adjunct instructor through a continuing education program that used high school classrooms after hours. He also volunteered with a local rescue association that assisted with standbys at football games and summer events along the lakes. His name appeared in community newsletters associated with equipment donations and blood drives. He was not marginal to civic life. He was in the center of it. On the first Sunday of the search, he arrived early at the library staging point in a green pickup with a toolbox in the bed. He unloaded lawn flags, a roll of survey tape, and a cardboard box filled with clipboards and pre-printed grid sheets. He had used the same materials at brushfire perimeters and at lost hiker drills. Volunteers recognized him from CPR classes. He logged in at the table like everyone else, wrote down the time he arrived, and stood aside until an officer assigned sectors. When a coordinator asked for someone to handle first aid supplies at the staging area, he agreed and set up a folding table with bandages, water jugs, and disposable gloves. He monitored blisters and minor cuts and advised volunteers to rotate after an hour. He repeated the standard instruction about not touching potential evidence and about flagging items for sworn personnel. He did not enter the taped vehicle perimeter. He kept to the assigned role. He contacted the family and offered to help with logistics. He arranged coolers and coffee at the high school parking lot when the search moved there. He drove a relative to the station to make a statement and waited in the lobby while the interview proceeded. He stood in the back row at a candlelight vigil organized by a local church and remained until the end to coil extension cords. He did not speak into a microphone. When a local radio station aired updates, he appeared briefly to encourage people to check outbuildings and to avoid spreading rumors. The comments were generic and procedural. During the first week, he met with detectives along with other visible volunteers to discuss staging, safety, and which sectors could be covered by foot. He brought a folded map with the service roads and posted notes on where trucks typically entered the warehouse area. He pointed to the turnout and said he had responded to a medical call near there the previous winter and noted the grade toward the water. He told them the gate cable could be lifted enough for a small vehicle to duck under if the padlock wasn't seated. The observations were accurate. He added that wind on the Riverwalk could push scent laterally during a K9 track. The K9 handler nodded. None of this was secret information. It matched what the handler had already logged. He gave a voluntary statement about his movements on the Saturday night of the disappearance. He said he had been at home, off call, and had not been dispatched. He stated he had not visited the library that evening and that his last contact with the missing woman had been transactional, using the copier near the front desk earlier that week. He signed the statement. The department had no basis at that time to challenge it. Unit logs from the ambulance service showed no call to his crew during the relevant period. Neighbors were not certain whether his truck had been present overnight. One neighbor said he went to bed early and did not check. The lack of a dispatch entry and the absence of a cell phone record kept the timeline open rather than closed. His relationship to the library was ordinary. He used the copier weekly, borrowed travel guides, and spoke with staff about CPR sessions the department scheduled in the community room. Staff recognized him as polite and efficient. He did not have any documented personal connection to the missing woman beyond being a regular patron. At the vigil, he stood near the back with other city employees and volunteers. He did not position himself near the family. He did not seek press attention. His presence was unlikely to register to anyone not keeping a list. Over the winter, he occupied roles that intersected with the case without becoming the case. He stored extra flyers in the Rescue Association's cabinet and placed a stack at the dispatch window. He delivered a box of gloves and hand warmers to the staging area when a cold front pushed in during late October. He raised a small amount of cash in a donation jar at a first aid class and gave it to a family representative with a receipt. He did not retain funds. He did not act outside ordinary channels. In 2000, he assisted with unrelated events, a charity 5K, a lakeside safety demonstration, and a 4th of July standby. Each event put him in front of groups as an organized, competent person. He maintained a routine schedule, work shifts, classes, errands. His residence on a side street near the north end of Opechee Bay did not draw attention. He kept his property in order. He mowed regularly. He stored a red canoe upside down along the fence line, secured with a nylon strap. These details would later be documented during a search warrant. At the time, they had no investigative meaning. He was not the only visible volunteer. A group of people organized meals, printing, and carpooling. If his name appeared further up a list, it was because he had durable equipment and knew how to run sign-in tables and safety briefings. He had done these tasks before. The search committee used what was at hand. A person who knew how to organize a shift board would organize the shift board. A person who knew how to manage first aid would manage first aid. He fit both categories. He kept his contact with the family measured and procedural. When he stopped by their house, it was to drop off printed maps or to clarify staging times. He did not sit for long conversations. He did not insert himself into private spaces. He called a sister of the missing woman once to relay the times for the next day's search and to say the first aid tent would be restocked. He was thanked. The call ended. These were the boundaries he observed. They were consistent with what an EMT instructor would observe. During 2001, when the state lab returned preliminary reports that contained no latent prints of value from the recovered tape, and when the hair on the adhesive was noted as rootless, the case did not change for the public. Internally, detectives kept a list of people whose names appeared frequently in the file. His name appeared as an instructor, a volunteer, and a contact. He was listed with dozens of others for elimination prints and reference DNA if needed. When detectives requested rolled fingerprints from a set of high-contact volunteers for elimination purposes, he complied at once at the station. Those were standard inked 10-print cards. Palm prints were not universally collected for elimination in 1999-2001. His rolled prints did not match any latent recovered from the vehicle interior or tote. There were no good latents to compare from those surfaces. The adhesive on the tape remained unprocessed by high-sensitivity methods during those years. He made suggestions that aligned with his training. At a midweek meeting in November 1999, he recommended that search lines avoid trampling the inside edges of the service road where a shoe impression could be preserved. He mentioned debris fields at waterlines and advised that if an item were to surface, it would likely appear after a storm shift rather than in calm weather. He did not offer speculation about motives or suspects. His comments stayed within logistics. He continued to teach classes. A line on a community flyer read, CPR AED certification, instructor, name omitted, EMTI. The class met in a classroom adjacent to the library basement entrance. Students were adults seeking certification for employment. He carried in a duffel with mannequins, airways, and rolls of white medical tape used to secure training pads and mark lines. He also kept a roll of gray duct tape in his truck, used for ancillary equipment repairs and to secure tarps at field standbys. Neither item was unusual for someone in his role. When an officer asked him in 2002 if he would be willing to speak again about the Saturday night time frame, he agreed and repeated his earlier statement. He described finishing chores during the afternoon, eating at home, and turning in early. He said he did not leave the house that night. He acknowledged knowing the industrial turnout because of previous calls, but denied being there on the night of the disappearance. He consented to a swab for reference DNA as part of a broad elimination effort the department was conducting to separate routinely handled items from possible evidentiary items. The swab was logged in a batch under a general elimination list with other volunteers. His consent was documented. That reference profile was used to eliminate his contact with public surfaces if needed. It was not used as a point of comparison against the hair on the tape because the hair lacked a nuclear DNA route. That limitation would become central later. He showed up when called for events that had nothing to do with the case. He assisted at a firehouse open house. He staffed a table at a health fair. He spoke briefly in a training session about scene integrity and warned new volunteers never to pick up items at an incident. He demonstrated how gloves can cross-transfer trace material if not changed between tasks. He told them to bag items in paper and to sign across evidence tape without breaking it. The instruction matched departmental training. A city employee who attended the session recalled later that his examples were specific and accurate. The fact that they overlapped with the missing person case was a function of the town's size, not necessarily of intent. He maintained a calm demeanor in settings where others were strained. When the family reduced public activity in 2001 and kept contact with the department private, he was not in their home. He was not a family friend. He was a person who had once stood near the staging board and who could be counted on to arrive on time for a shift if a shift existed. When shifts ended and the search ceased, his role shifted back to routine EMS instruction. Publicly, his name did not surface in discussions of suspects. The case had few public suspects. Most conversations centered on possibility rather than people: water, abduction by a stranger, an acquaintance who had left town. He did not leave town. He worked his shifts. He paid his mortgage. He kept his truck in running order. He stored a coil of nylon rope on a garage shelf next to a toolkit and extra tape. When a storm took down a tree on his street in 2002, he helped clear it. A neighbor thanked him in a note left in his mailbox. He kept the note. Internally, the cold case review in mid-2003 generated a shorter list. The detective who had taken over reread statements with an eye toward access to the service road and familiarity with the warehouse area. He marked people with routine access. That list included employees, delivery drivers, and public safety personnel. The EMT instructor's name appeared not because of a single anomaly, but because of cumulative presence, proximity to the area through work, familiarity with staging procedures, and the pattern of being available without being central to any one group. He was one of several names flagged for full palm prints if adhesive processing produced ridge detail. The flag did not indicate belief, it indicated readiness. When the state laboratory notified Laconia PD that vacuum metal deposition, VMD processing, would be available for selected adhesive evidence, the detective prepared a sealed memo summarizing candidates for comparison should ridge detail emerge on the tape fragments collected near the car. The memo listed elimination prints on file, people who had already provided 10-print cards, and those for whom palm exemplars would be requested. The EMT instructor's file included his rolled fingerprints and reference buccal swab from the elimination list, but no recorded palm prints. The memo also noted that a hair embedded in one piece of tape had been accepted for mitochondrial DNA sequencing through an authorized lab, and that any mtDNA result would be compared to known reference populations and then used to narrow, not close, the field. During this period, the EMT instructor continued teaching. He reminded students to replace medical tape on mannequin faces between classes. He restocked the first aid kit in the training room. He signed in and out of buildings using a clipboard kept at the custodian's office. Those sign-ins documented habit and location, but were not dispositive of any night in 1999. The record that would matter was not created by a sign-in sheet. It would be created by the lab. He did not stop by the police station in 2003 to ask about the case. Most people had stopped asking regularly. The case had become a periodic item at city meetings, an update with no new public information. The family managed their contact with the department through a single detective. The search equipment had long been stored. The shift boards had been erased. The tote sat in evidence. The tape fragments sat in envelopes. The hair sat in a lab queue. The EMT instructor's role existed in the file as lines on sign-in sheets, unit rosters, and a voluntary statement. He was a person who had helped keep people organized when organization was needed. On paper, that is the profile of a person often described as helpful, reliable, and trained. In a town dependent on volunteers and part-time instructors, it is a profile that overlaps with dozens of others. The difference, when it came, did not come from profile. It came from the combination of two laboratory outcomes: ridge detail made visible on the adhesive through VMD, and an mtDNA sequence from the rootless hair preserved in that adhesive. Those two outcomes would not, by themselves, identify a person beyond doubt. Together, they would narrow the field to a single, testable path. The man who had set up clipboards and cautioned others not to touch evidence would stand on that path. The boxes in evidence did not move on their own. People moved them. The lab requests did not fulfill themselves. People prepared them, shipped them, and signed for them. The person later arrested had, for 4 years, been one of many who moved items, signed for items, and advised others how to do it correctly. That visibility established trust. The shock, when it registered, came from the intersection of that trust with the lab's results. The intersection had not yet been made public. It was contained in a sealed affidavit and a bench schedule. It was about to leave the lab bench and enter a courtroom file. The shift from an open file to an arrest warrant began on a bench schedule and a shipping manifest. In June 2003, the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory in Concord coordinated 2 parallel procedures on items logged in 1999: adhesive processing of 3 gray tape fragments and mitochondrial DNA sequencing of a rootless hair embedded in one of those fragments. The adhesive work used vacuum metal deposition, VMD, available through a regional lab with that capability. The hair sequencing was authorized through a federal state agreement with the FBI laboratory's mitochondrial DNA unit. VMD applied a thin film of metal, in sequence gold and zinc, under vacuum to develop latent ridge detail on non-porous surfaces, including adhesive faces, where conventional powdering or dye stains would compromise evidence. The tape fragments were mounted, introduced into the chamber, and processed under strict contamination controls. Photographs were taken at each stage. On fragment 2, approximately 1.8 inches long, curled on itself, VMD developed latent friction skin detail consistent with a partial left palm. The area showed a clear hypothenar region with working creases and multiple ridge characteristics. 2 examiners conducted ACV analysis comparison evaluation verification. The first examiner marked minutiae, ridge endings, bifurcations, and a delta at the border of the hypothenar. The second examiner reviewed blind. Both concluded the latent had value for identification. The lab's report documented that the latent detail was on the adhesive face. The substrate had been protected by the curl and by sealed storage since October 1999. Notes recorded that Fragment 2 had not been previously subjected to destructive enhancement. The chain of custody log showed continuous control from collection to processing. The significance of an adhesive side impression was spelled out. Ridge detail in adhesive is most consistent with direct contact at or near the time the adhesive is exposed. Secondary transfer through gloves or over time is possible in general terms. It is not a default explanation where the adhesive remained protected and sealed, and where the ridge flow and clarity indicate primary deposition. In parallel, the rootless hair from fragment 1 underwent mtDNA sequencing of the hypervariable regions. The FBI lab produced a sequence and returned an interpretive report. The hair's mitochondrial profile did not match the victim's maternal reference. It belonged to an unknown male individual on the maternal line. The report stated the profile occurred at a low frequency in reference populations. It was not uniquely identifying, but was exclusionary for most individuals. The report included quality metrics and documented that the hair lacked a root sheath and therefore could not be used for nuclear STR profiling. With VMD latent palm detail of value and an mtDNA sequence in hand, the detective's memo sent earlier to the county attorney became a plan. The first step was to collect full palm exemplars from individuals on the priority list. Rolled fingerprints were already on file for many volunteers. Palm exemplars were not. The Laconia PD, with county attorney approval, requested voluntary palm prints from several people who had regular access to the service road area and whose names appeared repeatedly in the file. Most complied. A few were served with orders. The EMT instructor complied. An inked set captured thenar, hypothenar, and interdigital areas of both palms with attention to creases. Comparison proceeded at the state lab. The latent from fragment 2 was compared to palm exemplars using ACE-V. The examiner documented corresponding ridge characteristics between the latent hypothenar and the left palm exemplar of the EMT instructor. The correspondence included spatial relationships not limited to minutia counts, ridge flow, crease intersections, and the relative position to the ulnar edge. A second examiner, blind to the first's markings, repeated the comparison and reached the same conclusion: identification. The lab noted no unexplained dissimilarities. The report summarized that the latent friction skin impression developed by VMD on the adhesive face of fragment 2 was made by the left palm of the EMT instructor. Concurrently, items collected under the October 2003 search warrant were processed. Among them, a partially used roll of gray duct tape was taken from the instructor's truck toolbox. The roll's brand was common. Its adhesive chemistry offered no unique source attribution. However, the free end of the roll exhibited a torn edge. One of the 1999 fragments, fragment 3, also had a torn edge. The other side had been cut cleanly, consistent with scissors. A physical fit comparison, end match, was attempted. Under magnification, the torn contour of fragment 3's edge and the roll's free end exhibited a complementary interdigitation. The lab documented the alignment with a photographic series and concluded that fragment 3 and the seized roll were originally part of the same strip of tape. The report used conservative language. Physical fit, consistent with a common origin. The finding did not rely on brand or width. It relied on the irregularities unique to a torn edge. The mtDNA sequence from fragment 1, while not individually identifying, became a narrowing tool. With appropriate consent orders, investigators collected buccal swabs for mtDNA reference from the EMT instructor and from available maternal line relatives to establish his mtDNA profile. The profile matched the hair from the adhesive fragment. The report explained that a match indicates the hair could have originated from the EMT instructor or anyone in his maternal lineage. It excluded individuals with different mtDNA sequences. It was not admitted as identity in itself. It was admitted as a non-exclusion consistent with the rest of the evidence. The county attorney prepared a sealed affidavit incorporating 1. The VMD developed latent palm identification to the EMT instructor's left palm. 2. The physical fit between fragment 3 and the roll seized from his truck. 3. The mtDNA sequence match to his maternal line. 4. The original scene context documenting the fragment's collection near the driver's door of the victim's vehicle, the protected storage conditions, and the chain of custody. And 5. His statements about not being at the service road on the relevant night. The affidavit avoided speculation. It placed each element in sequence and attached certified lab reports and examiner CVs. A grand jury in Belknap County returned an indictment in late October 2003 for second-degree murder, alleging that he knowingly caused the death of the 28-year-old library assistant during the commission of a kidnapping. The state did not present a recovered body, it presented a body of physical and biological evidence. At arraignment, the court ordered him held pending trial. Defense counsel filed motions challenging the admissibility of VMD-enhanced prints, the physical fit methodology, and mtDNA interpretation. The court scheduled a Daubert-Lanigan hearing. At the hearing, the state called examiners from the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory and, for VMD, the Regional Lab's VMD unit. They described the physics of VMD, its applications to adhesive surfaces, published validation studies, and its acceptance in forensic laboratories. The friction skin identification was presented under ACEV, with verification by a second examiner and documentation of features. The defense cross-examined on potential for secondary transfer and on examiner subjectivity. The court ruled that VMD processing met admissibility standards and that friction skin identification derived from VMD-developed latents was admissible when supported by proper documentation and verification. The court admitted the physical fit evidence as a comparison technique widely used and subject to visual demonstration. The court admitted mtDNA sequencing with limiting instructions regarding its non-uniqueness. Trial began in early 2004. The state's case moved by chronology and methods. Jurors saw photographs of the turnout, the car, and the placement where the fragments were recovered. The evidence custodian testified to seals, logs, and storage. A lab photographer presented the VMD image progression and the final latent palm print. The friction skin examiner walked through marked features and explained the hypothenar identification to the defendant's left palm. Physical fit was demonstrated with the fragment and the roll under magnification. The interlocking torn edge was displayed as a series of stills. The mtDNA analyst testified to the sequence and to the match with the defendant's maternal line profile, with the court's limiting instruction read again before testimony. The state also introduced the defendant's prior statements. He had said he was not at the service road on the night of the disappearance. He had said he had no contact beyond ordinary library use. The prosecutor argued that his palm impression in the adhesive on tape collected feet from the victim's locked car, combined with the tape fragment's physical fit to a roll in his truck, refuted those statements. The presence of his mtDNA profile on a hair embedded in a separate fragment added weight. The state did not assert an exact sequence of events inside the turnout. It asserted contact with the victim's vehicle area at the relevant time and control over tape deployed at the scene. The defense emphasized the defendant's public service, his routine use of duct tape in classes and field events, and the possibility of transfer. They argued that physical fit implied only that the fragment and the roll once shared a torn edge, not when that edge was torn. They argued that mtDNA could implicate anyone on his maternal line. They noted the absence of a body and the lack of blood in the victim's car. They suggested the tape fragments could have been dropped earlier or later by someone else who had handled the defendant's tape. On rebuttal, the state returned to storage conditions and to the adhesive face latent. The adhesive had been protected and sealed since collection. The latent was developed on that adhesive face. The hypothenar latent was not an incidental smudge. It bore multiple corresponding ridge features in a configuration the examiner could trace and the jury could see. The physical fit was not generic. It was an interlock of unique torn microfeatures. The combination of adhesive side palm identification and physical fit located the defendant's hand at the tape used at the turnout near the victim's driver's door. The mtDNA did not name the defendant, but it excluded millions of others and agreed with the other findings. The state acknowledged that mtDNA is non-unique and that duct tape is common. It asked the jury to consider the totality. The court instructed the jury on circumstantial evidence and on the weight of expert testimony. The jury deliberated across 2 days. They returned a guilty verdict on second-degree murder. The court polled the jurors. Each answered yes. At sentencing, the state presented a pre-sentence report. The family submitted statements that described the 4-year interval with factual specificity, unanswered dates on a calendar, regular calls to the detective, and the stable presence of the missing person's photograph at the library desk. They did not address the defendant. They addressed the court. The court imposed a sentence within statutory bounds. 35 years to life in state prison. The court noted the absence of a recovered body, but found the evidence weighty. A latent palm print on the adhesive face of tape collected adjacent to the victim's vehicle, identified to the defendant. A physical fit linking a fragment to a roll in his possession. mtDNA consistent with his maternal line. And the timing and location consistent with the disappearance. The court ordered restitution for investigative expenses as allowed. The defendant was remanded. His certifications were revoked by the relevant boards. The Rescue Association removed his name from rosters. The library removed the small training flyer that had listed his classes. The desk kept the photograph of the 28-year-old woman until the verdict, then moved it to a framed memorial near the periodicals. The process closed at the same pace it had advanced, with logs, signatures, and files that match. The New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory closed out its bench notes with a final disposition entry. The FBI laboratory returned a letter acknowledging the court's acceptance of its mtDNA report and the restrictions under which it had been admitted. The evidence custodian at Laconia PD documented the status of the fragments and the seized roll, retained under court order. The district court docket reflected post-trial motions denied. Appeals were filed as a matter of right. No stay was granted. The family spoke to the press as little as possible. In court, they said only what procedure required. After sentencing, they issued a brief statement through the county attorney. They recognized the work of Laconia PD, the New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit, and the state laboratory. They thanked volunteers. They acknowledged that the case ended in a courtroom rather than at a river's edge. At the library, a small note at the circulation desk announced the scholarship in the victim's name for a student seeking certification in library services. The note contained dates and nothing added. The turnout behind the warehouse did not acquire permanent signage. The chain-link fence rusted, the cable sagged, and traffic continued on the service road. Within the police department, the case file moved from the active shelf to a closed shelf with a new tab indicating disposition. The tape fragments remained sealed. The roll remained sealed. The palm card remained in evidence under court order. The mtDNA report remained in the binder with its limiting instruction attached. The narrative of the case aligned with the requirements the court accepted. Not speculation, not confession, not accident, but physical and biological evidence applied under documented methods. The hinge points were technical. VMD to reveal a latent on adhesive, physical fit of a torn edge, and mtDNA to narrow the field. Those methods did not replace investigation. They focused it. The arrest at 7:18 a.m. on October 14, 2003, the indictment that followed, and the sentence in 2004 resulted from that focus. Closure in this context is administrative rather than absolute. The town returned to routine with a verdict in its files. The family held a quiet service in a small church near the library and returned home. The library's evening desk continued to log circulation with initials and timestamps. The photograph at the memorial remained. The case that had moved by inches for 4 years ended with a judgment pronounced in a small county courtroom. The science that carried it there stayed in the file as diagrams, sequences, and prints that can be matched to the dates and signatures that brought them into evidence.